Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming. My name is Bertrand-de Chapel. I am at the International Diplomatic Academy in Paris as a program director, and I'm also a member of the board of directors of the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, ICANN. And in the previous 4 years, I was the thematic ambassador and special envoy for the French Foreign Affairs Ministry in most of the topics dealing with Internet governance, the Internet Governance Forum, ICANN, the Commission on Science and Technology for Development, and various UN-related processes. So what I want to talk about today is, as indicated on the slide up there, the question of how Internet impacts international relations and how to handle the challenges that the Internet causes. WikiLeaks, Twitter, Facebook, and Google are only some elements and actors of the Internet revolution, but the emergence of those large platforms does have an impact on international relations, and the use of the Internet as a general trend is impacting international relations. Before I get into the substance itself, I want to highlight two big evolutions that we're witnessing and that we must keep in mind when we talk about the Internet. The first evolution is that the Internet is a social space. It's not only a technological infrastructure, it's not only an economic space. It is a social space, or probably better, social spaces. Some are private, some are public. And in general, this is a place where individuals interact. The second big trend that is relatively recent is that the Internet has become real-time and mobile. What I mean by real-time is that instead of having just access to databases like the World Wide Web, we now use mostly feeds through Twitter, through Facebook, and many RSS feeds, blogs, and things like that. But the second element in this trend is that we're moving from the traditional computer attached to a landline to things that are more and more mobile and that change the interface and interaction through tablets, iPads, and things like that. So I just wanted to start with those elements because when we talk about the Internet, we have a tendency to think about the infrastructures, the cables, the tubes, the airwaves, whereas there's another layer of access to databases and a third layer, which is basically what we could call a social net. What I want to deal with today are three elements. The first element is that the policy issues related to the Internet are not particularly new. It's just that they take a new dimension because they're global and transborder. The second point I want to address is that because they are more complex and transborder, these issues are putting an institutional challenge to the existing structures that we use to do policy. And the third element is that to give an answer to this challenge, there's a new approach that is being explored at the moment in various laboratories, including in ICANN, but also in the so-called Internet Governance Forum, that is called the Multi-Stakeholder Approach, which basically tries to associate government, civil society, and the private sector. So very quickly on the first point, what are the topics that we basically address? I don't have to highlight that in the last few months and years, the Internet has moved in the newspapers and magazines from the technology and economic pages to the international relations pages, the relationship between Google and China, the impact of Twitter and Facebook in the Arab world, and in general, in the case of Facebook, for instance, we're moving to an area where public policy issues like privacy are becoming a major international question. And so, of course, this has an impact, which is geopolitical dynamics. The fact that one country, one government, one actor in one country has an impact on actors in another country is growing. The Internet is connecting diasporas, which is a very good thing, and at the same time is creating potential tensions. As we saw in North Africa, Those platforms, particularly Facebook and Twitter, allow for what is called a solution to the dilemma of collective action. The dilemma of collective action is if you're unsatisfied with something, and particularly with your government, you're always, if this is a repressive government, you're always afraid that you will come out alone, that you will be put in jail, and you don't act until you are more secure and more sure that other people share the same concern. What those platforms, Twitter and Facebook, enabled was to show to people in Northern Africa, among other things, that other people were sharing the same concerns and that people were getting in the streets so that there was less danger to join them. And so it had a catalytic power to solve the dilemma for collective action. At the same time, we're witnessing in many countries a sort of governmental backlash against the freedoms that are being introduced by the internet. And more generally speaking, as many critical infrastructures, including electricity or other fundamental infrastructures and utilities, are depending upon the internet for their correct maintenance, there is an element of growing vulnerability in terms of danger of attack. I don't even go to the dimension of cyber war, but I don't have to elaborate much for you to understand or be reminded that the internet is producing those geopolitical dynamics that are deeply transforming the environment. However, what I want to highlight and discuss today is rather about another dimension. I highlight here a picture from an old movie from the 80s called Cyber Games, I think, which basically illustrated the power of two students and two kids. And this is an element just to remind you that in the case of cyber war and cyber warfare, it is very difficult to know where the threat is coming from. And the question of attribution in particular is delicate. So the first message, unfortunately, is that in terms of geopolitical dynamics, there is a potential for tension. And one of the big challenges is how to avoid this potential of tension to realize itself and materialize itself. What are the rules of behavior and what are the frameworks of governance to manage the interaction of people on the internet? And so the point I want to highlight more in this presentation is less the geopolitical dynamics and tensions and more the policy dimension at the international level related to the internet. And in particular, these policy issues, freedom of expression, privacy, intellectual property rights, taxation, cybercrime, and so on, they're fundamentally not original. They're not new. Every single country has to address those issues at the national level. However, what is interesting is that each of them is taking a new dimension with the internet. For those of you who are familiar with a scientific field that is called complex dynamic system theory, there's an expression that says more is different. And in the case of the internet and those issues, it is particularly applicable because the problems that we have to handle at a level of a couple of million people at the national level, when you have to deal with the same problems with a population of 2 billion people on the internet, it takes a different dimension, not only in terms of geographical expansion, but in terms of the sheer number of people and the complexity of their interaction. And so if I quickly go through each of those topics, freedom of expression is far from being a very new topic. It's fully encompassed in the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, Article 19 and 29. And I was at the Russian Internet Governance Forum yesterday, and somebody rightly made the comment that if you read Article 19, which was written in 1948, the mention that it is about the freedom to receive information irrespective of borders is incredibly prescient. The fact that it could be written in 1948 when none of the real mass media that we know, let alone the internet, were even foreseeable, is absolutely amazing. It's almost as if Article 19 was written for the internet. And so the problem is that 2 billion users plus going to 3 billion is making very hard to find common rules for people who do not have the same cultural environment, the same political or religious beliefs. And so the challenge of coexistence and the management of defamation, hate speech, politically sensitive topics is very difficult. It is very hard to think about uniform rules, and even harder to find the applicable jurisdiction. I give you a very concrete example. If you have somebody in Australia that makes a slander or a libel against somebody who is based in Canada, using a platform like Facebook that is hosted in the US, what is the applicable jurisdiction if you want to handle this case? Most likely the American jurisdiction, because Facebook is actually based in the US. But I'm sure you could argue that it is either Canada or Australia as well. So freedom of expression is raising very important questions regarding jurisdiction. It's the same about privacy and data protection. Because as a matter of fact, you have very different rules regarding privacy and data protection in different countries. In the US and in the EU. And when we're talking about social media, we're actually talking about a different notion of privacy. And it's not only data that has been collected by an entity in spite of you. It's data that you voluntarily put in the platform. And so it's more a management of intimacy than the sheer question of privacy. Cloud computing and geolocation are adding another layer because the data is shifting through borders around the world. And geolocation is now aggregating an incredible amount of data regarding the different places where everybody is on a daily basis. So coming back to what I was saying in the beginning, we do not have just a single cyberspace. We have several different spaces regarding privacy. Some are closed, some are semi-open, and some are completely open and public. I will go much quicker on the other topics because it's just a panorama to try to highlight the different challenges. Intellectual property rights are mostly geography-based, and the issues of privacy have different interpretations in different countries. Taxation, likewise, is something that is re-emerging. There was an initial regime to favor e-commerce with very low taxation. And this has grown and is coming back as a topic at the moment. And finally, regarding cybercrime, we have questions like phishing or counterfeiting and other illegal activities. The problem in all those domains is that law enforcement is difficult, and that the question of jurisdiction is hard to find and hard to solve. That's the general panorama. You see that the topics are not particularly new, that the challenges are not very different from what it was in the past. However, the scale is very different. So before I get into the institutional challenge that it represents, are there any questions or any things you would like to ask? Anybody?
On the previous part,
on this first part, yes. Or any other question that you want.
Oh, we'll have you need to ask you in the end.
At the end, yes, of course. Yeah. So let's get to the second part. The first element is, okay, we get new issues or issues with a different dimension. But those issues, they share common characteristics. And these characteristics make them particularly complex and difficult to solve. First of all, they are mostly transborder. Second, they involve actors that are not only governments. I mean, international relations used to be mostly the relationship between governments. Today, the relationship in international relations involve very large corporations, civil society activists, NGOs. And so the interconnectedness of our world and humanity through the information technology is bringing a new dimension to policy issues, including in a third characteristic, which is that there is a non-linear relationship between cause and effect. Non-linear interaction means that you can have a very small event that has a huge impact. What happened in North Africa and the Middle East in the last few months is a typical example. Who would have guessed that the death of a single person in Tunisia would trigger a chain of events that would basically oust two dictators and produce unrest in many other countries? Likewise, you have a picture here of this pastor in Florida who, because he is announcing that he will burn a Quran or create a burn a Quran day, which is particularly not a smart idea, is actually triggering a situation in Pakistan where there are riots and even dead people. This is a perfect example of a nonlinear effect, and it makes it extremely hard to respond to that kind of problems because it's going fast and it's scaling extremely rapidly with very little capacity to basically roll back those things. The problem is, until now, when you want to deal with policy issues, you basically have two types of tools. One is national regulation, and the other one is international regulations or international frameworks and organizations. The problem with national regulations in that domain is, first of all, it must be said that the internet is not an unregulated space. You will hear over and over again that people say, oh no, there's no rule on the internet, it's just the Wild West. It's not true. There are many, many, many national regulations regarding the internet, one way or the other. Either old regulations that are still valid or applicable, or new ones. The challenge is that this proliferation of frameworks makes it extremely difficult to articulate them with one another. There are conflicts of jurisdiction. There are sometimes incompatibility between different rules, which means that a given company has a big difficulty being in adhesion and respecting the legislation, in different countries. And finally, it is extremely difficult for governments who adopt national legislations to ensure compliance and enforceability when these regulations are not respected by somebody who's in another country. This leads to a notion that I'm trying to push forward, which is called the fractalization of sovereignty. What I mean by that, and a picture will probably illustrate that a little bit better. For those of you who are familiar with the notion of fractals, which is this dendritic type of surfaces or interfaces, what is meant by fractalization of sovereignty is the fact that if I am in France or in Russia, and I go on YouTube or I go on Facebook from France or from Russia, most of what happens on Facebook that I do is actually under the law of the United States, because the company is based in the United States. And the terms of service say that any problem relating to what you do there will actually be solved under the US law. Which means that somebody who is not on the US territory, who is not a US citizen, is actually under an extension of the US law. And this is true, of course, for any platform that is based in Russia that somebody is using from another country. So you have this sort of interpenetration of sovereignties that make it extremely difficult to solve things exclusively with national legislations. So what is the option? The other solution is international fora, is basically going to UN institutions, and I listed here on the left a few of the numerous institutions that are now dealing with internet issues. It's the Council of Europe, the European Union, of course, the OECD, Asia-Pacific Cooperation Organization, but also the United Nations General Assembly, the ITU, UNESCO, and even more recently, this year, the G8. The problem is, of course, these organizations have the legitimacy of being founded by governments who participate in them. But they're increasingly competing with one another. And they are increasingly taking the necessary time to develop rules, which makes it very difficult to cope with very fast-changing environments. Furthermore, they have a particular difficulty in accommodating non-governmental actors. How do you make NGOs and businesses participate in intergovernmental processes? It's very difficult procedurally speaking. Those institutions are not built for that. And so we are in a situation where in international organizations you have a monopoly of the representation of citizens by governments, which is how the international system is functioning and has been functioning until now. The problem is, if the international system has difficulties solving those issues, and if the only alternative is national legislations that do not solve them either, we're in a potential crisis. And we are in a dynamic tension where we have, on the one hand, bordered nations with frontiers, which are the building blocks of the international order. And on the other hand, a borderless internet whose value is precisely coming from the freedom of circulation and the freedom of circulation of information. And so it's not that one is going to replace the other, but there is today dynamic tension in how you articulate both. The second dynamic tension is that the international system is wonderful to deal with things that are within borders, within frontiers. It's basically something that says, as long as it's on your territory, it's your government that deals with it. The problem is that it makes it very hard to manage what is about commons, things that are shared, not things that are separated, things that are shared. And the internet is probably one of the ultimate commons. And finally, the principle of sovereignty and the principle of international relations is based on the national public interest and the collection of national public interest. However, the problem is, in certain cases, there can be a tension or conflict between the national public interest and the global public interest. In environmental law, for instance, many countries have a short-term national interest in not developing regulations that fight climate change. But we all understand that the global public interest requires that they do it. And so those tensions lead to a situation which can be quickly described as the international system that we have today, based on nation states, what we can call the Westphalian system, is very adapted to things that are few interactions among few states and mostly between governments. The problem is that when we are in this interconnected, interdependent world where many actors interact, meet, and transact, the international system is having difficulties. And as I said, the two choices of lengthy international processes or falling back into pure national legislations is a bad alternative, which leads to the question of what is the way forward? And I want to introduce here, for those of you who are not familiar, a concept that emerged during the World Summit on the Information Society, which is internet governance. Before I get there, any questions on this second part?
So,
Yeah.
you show us.
It is a very good question, because the question is what I said before regarding Facebook, applicable also if I enter a different domain name address, which would be facebook.ru for Russia or for another country, and if the servers, if it were in Turkey, the servers are based in Cyprus, for instance. Your question is extremely important because the answer is usually embedded in the terms of service of the company. And in certain cases, if you look at the terms of service of Facebook, and I actually will address that a little bit further, in the terms of service of Facebook, the terms of service say US law is applicable. However, there's just one little star somewhere that says, by the way, if you're from Germany, look at this other page, because that's the way it works for Germans, which is very interesting. And the question of the domain name is something I will address because you're absolutely right. Depending on whether the domain is facebook.com or maybe facebook.cn, if they ever got to China, or facebook.australia, some changes may be put in place and the legal environment may change. And actually, this is interesting because your question is exactly where I want to lead you in the end regarding the impact of domain names and the legislation that is related. So I'll come back to that, but thanks for the question. Any other comment that far? No? Move forward? Okay. So who in this room has heard about the World Summit on the Information Society? Raise your hand. Oh, wow, that's great. 2, wow. Okay. It's true that it's some time ago now. It's making me look old. Anyway, between 2002 and 2005, we had a 4-year process called the World Summit on the Information Society, the WSIS. Who has heard about the Rio Summit on environment? 1982? A little bit more. Okay. So those are global summits that the UN was doing a lot in the 90s and the beginning of the 2000s. We don't do them that much anymore. However, the World Summit on the... Come in. The World Summit on the Information Society lasted from 2002 to 2005. And in many respects, people will consider that it is actually a very, a summit like most others. For those of you who came right now, I will just highlight where we are in this. There are 3 parts. The question is the impact of the internet on international relations. The first one was highlight a certain number of policy issues, and it's a good reminder for the others as well. The policy issues that we're addressing, like privacy, freedom of expression, taxation, intellectual property rights, and the challenge they pose in an internet environment. The second issue was why this is an institutional challenge, because the 2 tools we have, which are international organizations or national regulations, have their own problems to deal with those issues. And we're getting into the third element, which is why the concept of internet governance is an attempt to solve some of this conundrum. So, getting back on track, the World Summit of the Information Society was in many respects a summit like many others. 4 years, a very lengthy preparatory process, 2 major meetings of 15,000 people at the level of heads of state and governments, 180 countries, a big event in Geneva in 2003, and a big event in Tunis in 2005. What did it produce? Basically, 4 big documents, declarations, agenda of Tunis, declaration of principles, plan of action, very traditional in appearance. However, the reason why it is interesting is because it was indeed, in spite of this appearance of being similar to the rest, it was a defining moment for what we call now internet governance. And the concept is that this whole 4-year process produced basically 4 words. So, okay, you will tell me 4 years, 15,000 people, 180 countries for 4 words, maybe not a lot. However, those words are relatively interesting. there are two couples of words. The two first words are Internet governance, and the two others are governance forum. Let me take each of them one after the other. Internet governance has received a precise definition in one of the documents adopted in Tunis, called the Tunis Agenda, which is now the Bible that all of us are holding, a little bit like in the Chinese old times, people were holding the little red book. This is a small blue book that has the 4 documents, and we keep going back to the paragraph 30, 35, 68, 69. And it's almost a theological debate among those who participated in the WSIS and are still in those processes 10 years later, to basically throw at each other the very delicate compromise that was achieved in Tunis. However, the definition that was given for Internet governance is the following. It has 4 blocks. It is the development and application by governments, civil society, the private sector, and international organizations in their respective roles, of principles, norms, rules, decision-making procedures, and programs that shape the evolution and use of the Internet. It's a long definition. But I want you to really look at those 4 blocks because they are extremely important in terms of a definition of governance. You will hear a lot of people in Internet space and in other topics say, but what is governance? We don't know what that is. Is it government? Is it? No. For the first time, there has been in a UN summit endorsed by 180 countries at the level of the heads of state, a definition of governance. And this definition, if I take each of the 4 blocks from the bottom up, which is normal because Internet governance has to be a bottom-up process, the evolution and use of the Internet is the affirmation that Internet governance deals with the infrastructure and what people do on the Internet. So it's the governance of the Internet and governance on the Internet. The second block is the notion of shared principles, norms, rules, decision-making procedures, and programs. For those of you who follow international law studies, you will probably recognize a classical formulation for what is called a regime. Principles, norms, rules, decision-making procedures, and programs is the definition of an international regime. Above is the most innovative element in the definition. It's by government, civil society, the private sector, and international organization in their respective roles. This is the definition of what has come to be named the multi-stakeholder approach. The private sector, the governments, civil society, and international organizations are all stakeholders in those issues. They have a stake. And the governance approach is actually trying to allow those different stakeholders to interact and work together to, and that's the fourth block, elaborate and apply or implement those regimes. It is not only about a sort of legislative process. Governance is not only defining the norm, it is also putting it in action and implementing it. So those 4 blocks can be summarized in a shorter way, which is a personal shortening of this definition. It's the multi-stakeholder development and application of shared regimes that shape the evolution and use of the Internet. And I want you to look at this definition because if you take a step on the side for 1 second and you take the very beginning up to the last word, you will see that it is implementable and applicable to any type of global governance issue. You can have water governance that is defined by multi-stakeholder development and application of shared regimes that shape, let's say, the management and use of water resources. And if you think about it, this is the most concise definition of what global governance is basically about. Okay, so coming back to the Internet in particular, I said the WSIS produced 4 words, Internet governance, and Governance Forum. The Governance Forum is the Internet Governance Forum, also known as the IGF. And you can see here the 5 events, because the IGF meets every year at the end of the year. The first one was in Athens in 2006. Then it was Rio de Janeiro in 2007, Hyderabad in India in 2008, Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt in 2009, and Vilnius in Lithuania in 2010. And if you look very, very, very closely on the first picture, you can see me at the very, very left. This is a fascinating experiment. How many of you have heard about the Internet Governance Forum? Okay. Strong message. Anybody who is interested in international relations in any way should have a look at this thing just for information. It is one of the most innovative experiments in international organizations that I've seen. The Internet Governance Forum gathers every year about 1,500 people from all around the world, from government, civil society, and the private sector. And its main characteristic is that it is entirely open to anyone who wants to participate. That is, if you want to go to the Internet Governance Forum, you just have to register online. And if you cannot go because you don't have the resources to go there, you can follow everything online. It's webcast, it is transcribed. Every single session, the main sessions, are taken in steno and transcribed live. There are remote participation tools. And so this is an experiment where government representatives, private sector and civil society actors, even individuals, participate on an equal footing. Anybody comes in and is allowed to participate. The second dimension is that it is completely self-organized. There is something called the Multi-Stakeholder Advisory Group, that is a group of about 40 people that are nominated by the UN Secretary General, but on proposal by the different stakeholder groups. So the business designates the people they want in, civil society as well, and governments as well, and the UN Secretary General basically nominates them formally. But this group is under the responsibility of a chair, and this group has the responsibility of organizing the event each year. But in organizing the event, it builds the agenda on the proposals for workshops that are made by the participant. So not only can you get in, but you can just send, and the call for this year IGF that will take place in Nairobi has just been finished. You can send a proposal and say, I want to organize a workshop with a few partners on this topic. And provided that the workshop is aggregating people from government, civil society, and the private sector, and deals with a topic that is within internet governance, it has an incredible likelihood to get in. There is just a little effort to not have too many, but fundamentally there is no control or censorship on the content of the workshops, which is unique in international processes. So it has its own agenda setting. And third, this thing is flexibly related to the United Nations. It is attached to the UN Secretary General, who is officially the convener. It takes place on UN territory, extraterritoriality. But the management is through a lightweight secretariat that is based in Geneva. And the relationship with the UN does not encompass the UN rules. All the rules of procedure of the IGF are basically developed by the community. So this is a unique experiment. We just had 5 years, and the United Nations General Assembly has decided at the end of last year to continue the experiment for another 5 years. And we're now discussing how to improve the functioning of this system, which every year is slightly modifying its modus operandi. But I want to highlight also another organization, because the IGF is a remarkable tool and experiment for what is called decision shaping. The IGF is a dialogue space. It doesn't make decisions. It allows people to interact on an equal footing and try to shape and frame the topics before they are really addressed by different other entities. It's a sort of watering hole every year for those issues. But there is another organization that actually predates the World Summit on the Information Society called ICANN, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. And I've been honored to be elected on the board of ICANN at the end of last year. The board of ICANN is a group of 15 people that basically supervise the functioning of the organization and ensure that its mission of global public interest is fulfilled. ICANN was created in 1998, and it was a pioneer experiment in what is now called multi-stakeholderism. And it is a private, non-profit association based in California, but it is an international organization. The board is international. You have people from Gambia, Australia, France, Germany, the United States, Chile, and South Africa. And so it's very diverse among those 15 people. And the participants are also coming from very diverse origins all around the world. And this organization is responsible for what is called the domain name system, Internet protocol addresses, and the domain names, the .com, .org, .net, and so on. And it basically can be considered as the first multi-stakeholder global agency or global regulator for a very limited domain, which is the domain name system, the whole addressing system for the internet. I'll make just a brief parenthesis here because it's important to know or to be sure that you know more or less how the internet functions. At the bottom line, every computer or every server on the internet has one address, which is an IP address, an Internet Protocol address, which is a long string of numbers, a little bit like a telephone number, but longer. And so when you connect to the internet, usually your internet service provider gives you a number temporarily, or you have a permanent one. And every single server that you want to reach, Google, Facebook, whatever, has its own IP address that you have to connect with. But as it was a little bit complex to remember those addresses, and also they were changing regularly, somebody invented, a person called Mocha Petris, invented what is called a domain name system, which is a hierarchical system where you have .com, .net, .org, but also these are called generic top-level domains, and also .fr, .ru, .de for Germany, .uk for England, which are called country code top-level domains. And when you type in your browser google.com, it uses a big database, which is a little bit like a Yellow Pages directory, that says, oh, google.com at this moment is accessible on the IP address so-and-so, so that the routing system of the internet knows where to send your request. That's the bottom line. You don't need to know more. But ICANN is in charge of the management of the allocation, supervising the allocation of the IP addresses by the so-called regional internet registries, and also managing the top-level domain system, like who manages .com, who manages the distribution of the domain names at the second level. So it is a regulator in a certain way, and it has three functions. One is a notary function, which is to keep this Yellow Pages book accurate. It's called the IANA function, the Internet Assigned Names Authority. The second function is that when you buy a domain name, it can be delachapelle.com if I want it, or google.com or whatever, you don't buy it at the manager of .com or through the manager of .com. You buy it, which is called a registry. You buy it through a registrar, which is basically the equivalent of a retail as opposed to the registry being the wholesale. It's not a good analogy, but it's the simplest analogy. So there are several rules that have to take place in order to make sure that this market of the distribution of domain names at the second level functions correctly, and that the registries respect the agreements they have with ICANN that allowed them to function under the auspices of ICANN. And so there's a competition authority role here for the existing top-level domains and registrars, accreditation of registrars, compliance, and so on. And the third level is what I call the regulator of the semantic spectrum, because we are now planning to introduce new top-level domains. As I said, you had country codes about 240, and you have generic top-level domains, about 20, .com, .org, .net, and a few others that have been added, like .jobs, .info, .biz. But now, probably in the course of this year, a call will be open for the introduction of new top-level domains. You can have a .Paris, you can have a .Moscow, you can have a .IBM, a .Facebook, you could have a .sports, .music. You could have that in Cyrillic as well. You can have it in Chinese. And so it's a broad opening up of the domain name space, and it is a sort of a little bit like the frequency spectrum, just its names spectrum. So it's a semantic spectrum, and the responsibility of ICANN is to develop with the community the rules that will organize who manages what is authorized, and so on. So IGF, on the one hand, a direct product of the World Summit on the Information Society, which is a tool for decision shaping and dialogue on a whole range of issues. And on a very particular domain, which is the domain name space, ICANN is actually a decision-making entity. And I want to finish on this notion of internet governance on these two laboratories, because ICANN and the IGF are the two laboratories where we're trying to experiment a new interaction between government, civil society, and the private sector. By highlighting one thing, which is what I personally call the governance workflow. The elaboration of any regime goes actually through the same stages, whether it's at the national level, at the global level, it's always the same. You get an initial stage. You get the drafting. The initial stage is basically framing the topic. What do we want to talk about? Then you have a drafting phase with a smaller number of people. Then you need to have an authority that adopts and validates. Then you get to the implementation and the enforcement, monitoring, and so on. Normally, in a national level, all those stages are actually managed by the public authorities. In a multi-stakeholder environment and a multi-stakeholder approach, at the international level in particular, the participation of those actors vary according to the issue, the entity where the issue is being discussed, and the moment in the course of the discussion. So in the early stages, initiation and drafting, you have a much larger and wider participation of the actors than in the adoption phase, where it needs the authority of a limited number of actors. And in the implementation and enforcement, again, you find a lot of actors that contribute to the enforcement. And particularly, in many cases, you need the contribution of the users and the companies to spot infringement to rules. Last point, I'm talking about regimes, and I want to highlight that basically on a scale of things, from the less formal code of conduct to the most formal international treaty with an agency to allow enforcement, you have in between many variable formats. It can be frameworks, guidelines, principles, contracts, many new tools to arrange and memorialize the agreement between the actors. So a workflow with different roles for different actors at different stages, and a greater variety of instruments than the traditional international ones. So we've seen the three major dimensions: broad international issues, a sort of governance crisis because we need to find new tools, and two important laboratories of what is called the multi-stakeholder approach, the IGF, the Internet Governance Forum, and ICANN. I want to close this presentation with two key questions or two issues that are a bit provocative, but that are showing the way forward and the questions we may want to address, that in any case I am addressing at the International Diplomatic Academy in Paris. I strongly believe that history is not what most cynics talk about. When we talk about history, we usually talk about wars, betrayals, kings, elections, and things like that. The reality is that these are epiphenomenon, get ups and downs. The huge trend towards history is the constant effort of mankind towards a better and broader collective organizations. Because communications develop, transportation develops, and the human communities become bigger and bigger and bigger. And at each step, we try to find ways to organize the coexistence of people in each period. Which leads to the question, what is the governance for the digital age that is probably as important a shift as the introduction of the printing press in the 15th century? And I want to highlight two questions. If you look at this map, it looks familiar in terms of shape, but it is not exactly the continents and countries that you're familiar with. Because here the continents or the countries are actually the social media, the social spaces. Facebook, Twitter, MySpace, and some social networks that we don't necessarily know because they are in countries, the language of which we don't speak, but they're still important. And the size of the territory, I purposefully do not say the country, but the size of the Facebook territory, for instance, in there, is in proportion to the number of people, which actually is 500 to 600 million people today. And the question behind this is, what is the geography of cyberspace? Yes, it is a borderless space. But whenever you follow a link from a website to another, from a server to another one, you're actually crossing some kind of virtual frontier. If you're moving from youtube.com or from any google.com through a link that goes to a .fr website, there's a great likelihood that going through that link, you're actually changing the jurisdiction you're in. And so the question of geography of cyberspace is very important because cyberspace is organized around communities. And as I said, there are private spaces and public spaces and semi-private public. Cloud computing is blurring the boundaries again, because I am on Facebook servers, yes. But where are they located? I don't know. There may be a portion of it in Ireland, a portion of it in the US, a portion of it somewhere else, because there's a question of speed of access. As I said earlier, as long as you are on the Facebook territory, because you are on the servers of Facebook.com, you are, of course, under the US law, but you are under the terms of service of Facebook, which is basically the law of the territory. And for those of you familiar with modern art or art, there is a very famous painting by Courbet called The Origin of the World. And this represents a naked woman with her legs spread open. It was a very provocative picture at the time. It is hanging in museums. It's in all art books. It's all over the world. However, somebody posted this picture, which is a work of art, on Facebook. And it was removed because the bot that was checking for pornographic pictures actually considered that it was a pornographic picture. So it removed. So the rules of freedom of expression on Facebook are not the rules in the US or the rules in Europe or elsewhere. It is the rules of expression on Facebook. And it goes, of course, for other things. Dailymotion in France, which is an equivalent of YouTube, doesn't have exactly the same rules of what it posts and what it doesn't as YouTube. Without getting into too much detail, the key question is, instead of trying to solve problems of privacy on Facebook through national regulations, a collection of national regulations, or wait until an international treaty on privacy rules is elaborated, which may take years, is there a way to start a negotiation in Facebook or with Facebook on what is the privacy regime within Facebook, which is today designed and discussed exclusively by the administration of Facebook, but that must involve all the users and the governments of the countries where Facebook is accessible. Pushing further on that topic, citizenship is a good thing, but it's only one element of our identity. Actually, if I have a mobile phone with an IP address that is attached to it permanently, doesn't that become my identity online? If I'm moving around as a Frenchman, using a VPN in Saudi Arabia in my hotel room, is it the law of Saudi Arabia that dictates what I can look at? Or if I go through a VPN, is it the law of France that I have? How much of my IP address is going to be a virtual identity? I don't want to delve into the APIs, the application programming interface, it would take too long. But the last point I want to make on this notion of geography is, if you think about it, the domain name system, which is now relatively indifferentiated, and we don't really think about the country code domains and the generic domains. But with the expansion of the domain name space, depending on where the registry will be based, depending on the second level domain and the servers in cloud computing that the operator will use, you may be under one jurisdiction or another. Are domain names going to be virtual frontiers? And remember that a frontier is not necessarily something that is painful. I mean, in the Schengen environment in Europe, you can cross the border without problems. However, if I move from France to Belgium, anything that I do in Belgium or anything I do in France is under Belgium or French law. And still, I just took a road with a car and there was no border. It's a little bit like that in the internet. We don't pay attention to that. But as we're surfing through links, we're actually changing jurisdiction constantly. And so, is it time to discuss whether this can be voluntarily used to address the problem of conflicts of jurisdiction or not? Finally, and I promise it's the final slide, because I've been long, I want to finish with the other question, which is the notion of governance frameworks. So what do I mean by governance framework? And you will see a list of pictures that will surprise you, and apologies for those who will not have the list of slides, but any country can have a king or a queen or a president or a woman president, as in Brazil. I don't have to go much further. You already feel that there are very different governance frameworks in different countries. I mean, you have a very interesting experiment here in Russia, shifting your prime minister and president, which is a very innovative concept. But if you push the notion in the constitutional framework, you have very democratic monarchies and very non-democratic presidential systems. So many countries have different governance frameworks. But governance frameworks are not limited to political entities. Of course, those leaders can be a military ruler or a religious ruler. You can even have tribal systems that are much less formal, but that are really governance framework that actually have sustained their existence for sometimes thousands of years. To be honest, much longer than most of our constitutional frameworks. So in terms of sustainability, there probably are lessons there. But I can go further. An orchestra has its own governance framework. There's a director, but the players have their own rules to follow. And they are supposed to follow the partition. But go further, any kind of group. The community of sellers and buyers on eBay have a governance frameworks, which are the rules established by eBay on how you trade on eBay. The Supreme Court of the US has its own, any court for that matter, has its own governance frameworks and functioning rules. Any board of an association or a company has its own internal rules. Sports are governance frameworks. Sports federations have rules. Basically, any kind of human organization, and I put here groups of friends, you will recognize the TV series. When you're a group of 10 people going to the movies in the evening and you have to decide which movie you're going to see, you have a governance framework. It's an implicit governance framework. In one group, it's the leader that will decide. In other groups, they will discuss for ages. Every single human entity has an implicit or explicit governance framework. The problem is they're heterogeneous, very different. They are usually issue-based, not only geography-based as our nation-state system. They can be just on one topic in an association. It raises the question of the role of governments because the governments are not the only governance framework. There are many others. And the key question is how do you manage the coexistence and cohabitation or coordination between all those structures? In the past, we were solving the problem by saying, okay, the national boundary is the beginning and the end of the jurisdiction, and all the governance frameworks that are within that boundary are under the national law, and if they interact with something else, it has to be managed through a treaty. Today, all those governance frameworks interact in a very, very broad manner, which brings the question of interoperability. And what I want to leave you with is the notion of a governance protocol. The analogy is the following. In the 60s, and since then, the Internet protocol, TCP/IP, has allowed what is now more than 250,000 heterogeneous physical networks to interconnect into one global, single, interoperable internet. They didn't have to change. They remained heterogeneous. However, they interconnect. Likewise, in the 90s, the invention of the World Wide Web has allowed, through the HTML/HTTP protocol, the interconnection and interoperability of millions, literally, of heterogeneous databases that can be on an Oracle server, on MySQL. You don't care about it. As long as they use the HTML/HTTP, they are a part of the World Wide Web. I argue that we are at the same stage regarding those heterogeneous governance framework that we're talking about, and that we now are trying to build a governance protocol that will enable those heterogeneous systems to interact in a global governance framework without having to change, i.e., you don't need to force everybody to adopt the same type of democratic system to be able to do global governance. And this is the challenge. I want to leave you, before the questions, with those two avenues of interrogation. Is there a new geography for cyberspace that will redefine jurisdictions? And second, is there a way to organize in a multi-stakeholder manner the interoperability of these governance frameworks that are heterogeneous and need to work together to solve some of the issues? So, that's it. Are there any questions? So are there any questions? And again, questions can be asked in English or French. Yeah? The formulation, is it a new geopolitics of cyberspace or all geopolitics in cyberspace, is a very good way to formulate the question. I actually personally use quite frequently, I didn't do it today, but the expression the geopolitics of cyberspace is clearly the main question that we have to address. The role of governments is very interesting because it has changed regarding the internet issues considerably in the last, let's say, 5 to 10 years. Originally, there was a mantra in the internet environment among the techies that governments had nothing to do with the internet. They should not even be there. They were irrelevant and no way. At the other extreme, you have a tendency at the moment by some governments to say, because it's a policy issue, it's just a matter for governments to discuss among governments, and this whole multi-stakeholder thing is just nothing. So you have the two extremes, those who believe that governments are irrelevant and the other ones who believe that governments are exclusive. The reality is that in the last 5 to 10 years, mostly the last 5 years, the World Summit on the Information Society has made a sort of mutual recognition by the two types of actors. The governments have had to recognize that they couldn't handle those issues without the technicians and the business. Because they didn't have the competence or they lacked enforceability. But at the same time during that period, technical community and business and civil society had to recognize that you cannot count the governments out because they have power in the bad sense, but also in the good sense. When you need to enforce something, sometimes you're very happy that the government is there. So what is emerging now is the notion that is around the in their respective roles, which is a fuzzy notion at the moment, but that basically considers that governments are stakeholders, like others, but with some characteristic more than others. And if you remember the arch that I described in the 5 stages, it is absolutely clear that governments have a very important role in the validation adoption, because sometimes it is what is required to give official validity to an agreement that has been made by the stakeholders. So to go back to your direct question, yes, there is a bit of the old geopolitics coming back into the space. However, what I find fascinating about the internet environment is that it is really not a zero-sum game, i.e. it's not because somebody is winning that the others are losing. And to give you a very concrete example, within ICANN at the moment, there is a governmental advisory committee in ICANN, of which I was a member and even a vice chair during 2 years as a French representative, as the French representative. And there have been tensions in the past regarding what was the role of governments within ICANN. In the last few months, very recently, the role of the GAC, the Governmental Advisory Committee, has clearly grown because we're discussing this new GTLD program. And I've kept saying, and I repeat it very often, the value of this cooperation is that a stronger GAC, a stronger role for governments within the rules of ICANN means a stronger ICANN. And actually, in many cases, we would like to see more governments engaged in the international multi-stakeholder processes. And in particular, in the case of Russia, it's great to see Russia engaging more, and I hope that in ICANN and in the IGF they will do that. So geopolitics of cyberspace is a very good topic. Welcome. Any other question? Yeah.
First of all, I want to thank you for this.
So if I reformulate it, it's recorded. If the question is, are governments supporting the notion of internet governance because it is a way to gain more control? The answer is no. That's not the reason why they do it, but it's actually the positive result it will have. Let me explain. The reaction of governments, and there are some, who are worried about the freedom that is spread by the internet. But also some of them are worried about the bad things that happen on the internet, because there are bad things as well. The natural tendency is to return towards national legislation, as I said, because it's hard to use the international organizations to produce a treaty and so on, and people say, well, I mean, I need to do something, so I'm doing it. Some doing it carefully and positively, some do it less carefully, and it's really to tramp on the freedom. But surprisingly, those who are the most repressive are very against the multi-stakeholder model, because the multi-stakeholder approach is actually giving a voice to people they don't like to see around. I mean, the most repressive regimes, let's be honest, they want to remain cozily in the intergovernmental environment, because this is a place where you don't discuss the legitimacy of a government. In the UN system, and that's the only way it can function, don't get me wrong, if a government is there in the UN system as a representation, you don't question its legitimacy. Which means that if you're a repressive government, you like that, instead of going to a multi-stakeholder forum where people are going to bash you coming from nowhere. So the reality is, the ones who support this approach most are actually the governments who understand that there is a problem, who want to sincerely address it, but in an open and transparent manner, and who understand that they need the other actors so that they can get the leverage that they need to solve the problem. And to explain what I was saying in terms of the end result is that it strengthens the government, I always explain to people, and especially my ex-colleagues from governments, that contrary to what a lot of people think, those multi-stakeholder processes do not diminish the capacity of governments to act on internet matters. It brings it back to them, because the fractalization of sovereignty that I was mentioning is actually weakening the capacity of governments to act alone, even on their own territory. So if they participate in multi-stakeholder processes at the national and global level, they actually regain the capacity to address issues.
Thank you.
Any other question? No? Yep?
Hello, I want to thank you for your presentation today.
Is the UN the protocol between the different governance framework? The UN is a protocol. International organizations are a protocol of interaction between a certain type of governance frameworks. The UN is a protocol for interaction between governmental and nation-state governance framework. The system of the United Nations is basically what we call the Westphalian system, because it fundamentally dates back to the 1648 Westphalian Treaty that produced the foundation for the nation-state that emerged later on. As a matter of fact, when you think about it, the invention of the printing press triggered, we tend to forget it, in Europe, 30 years of religious wars, which were basically wars about access to information. Because it was a fight between those who thought that information, i.e. the Bible, should be mediated by the priest, and those who thought, no, people should read the Bible directly. And so this was maybe the first war on information access. It led to a religious war, which led to the Westphalian Treaty, which laid the foundation for the nation-state system that we're in. So there is a direct connection and link between the printing press and the UN system today. However, the limits of the system, as I tried to explain, is that it does not allow for interoperability with all the other governance frameworks. People who establish their own website, associations, companies, and so on. And so it's a little bit like the protocols that existed in the pre-internet era, or the pre-web era. Probably pre-web is better. Before the web, you had very structured databases. And I was, at the time, a consultant in a technology monitoring firm, and we were using very huge databases for scientific information or technical articles, Dialog, Datastar, and so on. All those databases had their own functioning rules. They didn't interoperate. And when they interoperated, it was through a sort of meta engine that could query one and the other. And suddenly on the side, somebody said, okay, why don't we do a general protocol for allowing everybody to interact together? And bingo, the World Wide Web started. And I can tell you, I remember at the time, 1992, 93, 94, all the people who were managing those very structured databases were just snubbing the World Wide Web. They say, oh, this thing is completely disorganized. We have structures, toponymies, and very important query keywords, and didn't work because they were too structured and couldn't interoperate. The internet and the web produced something that was much more dynamic and that allowed basically anybody to have a new idea and an invention. And in terms of governance, the challenge is the solution to a technical or political problem may come from somebody that has absolutely no power. It can be anybody of you who actually goes to an international forum, like the ones I mentioned, and who says, I mean, I represent nobody, but I think on that topic, it would be good if you could do this. And if the idea is good, it may be picked by somebody else and it will percolate. That's what we're talking about. So the UN system, let's put an analogy that may be a bit provocative. The UN system is a little bit like in the situation of AOL, you know, America Online, that used to be the dominant online service before the World Wide Web and basically was too rigid, too structured. And the saving grace of the UN is that the fight between the distributed protocol and distributed governance and the traditional governance doesn't need to be an either-or. I repeat it. The UN system is not going to disappear because of the internet. But what I believe is that those structures, those institutions, will develop a multi-stakeholder capacity by adding a forum space so that in the very early stages of the arch, you can associate everybody so that the issue is being framed by everybody. So I don't believe in the demise of the UN system. I believe in its progressive transformation, a little bit like we still have a monarchy in England, but nonetheless it's a parliamentary system. So you can have parliamentary monarchies or constitutional monarchies, like you can have multi-stakeholder and participatory international organizations. Any other question? No? So if, yeah, go ahead. No. It's clearly an actor. I mean, WikiLeaks, is WikiLeaks a stakeholder or not? It is clearly an actor. And for instance, you can analyze WikiLeaks. It's a long topic in itself. But what I find probably the most impactful is not WikiLeaks in itself, is that it became the crystallization and the realization that things have changed. Let me put it this way. And during the, how many of you have read a book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions by Thomas Kuhn? Yeah, okay, good. Typical change in scientific revolutions and paradigm shifts is moving from the Ptolemaic astronomic system to the Copernican model, like the sun in the middle instead of having the earth in the middle. And what Kuhn describes is that there are paradigm shifts where something new shows that the old theory doesn't work anymore. There's a battle of alternative theories, and one establishes itself because it explains experience better. And usually it comes because some observation device produces results of experiments that the old theory cannot explain. And that was the case with Galileo's telescope. He created the telescope, and it began making observations that absolutely didn't fit with the Ptolemaic model. It may seem far from WikiLeaks, but I'll come back to that. So the Ptolemaic model got into crisis. People said, listen, it doesn't explain his observation, there's a problem here. And so people began to patch the Ptolemaic system, add more complexity to the point that it became completely unworkable. And then somebody came and said, you know what, if you turn it upside down and you put the sun in the middle, it works quite well, actually. And this solution won because it was a better explanatory system for every observation people were making. But those paradigm shifts, in that case, it's an either or. You cannot have the Earth in the middle and the sun in the middle. It's one or the other. And the paradigm shift, as you know, has been pretty hard because some people have been killed for having defended the new paradigm. However, there are cases where the change of paradigm is not that drastic. It can be an enhancement. And what I want to highlight regarding WikiLeaks, I'm wondering whether, in a certain way, WikiLeaks hasn't played, and I'm almost thinking at this as I answer. I never made the analogy. It's an interesting one to explore. WikiLeaks is a little bit like Galileo's telescope. WikiLeaks exposed the nonlinear nature of the events. I mean, there's one guy, one single person in a base somewhere in Afghanistan or elsewhere who has access to an enormous amount of information, who can copy it on one disk and send it to one entry point, and it transforms completely the information and the knowledge and the relationship between the press and the... I mean, this is fascinating in terms of nonlinearity. The second thing is that it goes directly to the question of privacy and secrecy. It goes directly to the question of freedom of information. And so fundamentally, what WikiLeaks did was to be the Galileo's telescope saying, wait a minute, things have changed. And the impact it had is actually not that it exposed the US administration so much, because somebody was saying that yesterday. Ultimately, American diplomats came out as being very professional, making actually very accurate analysis, basically sharing the distrust of a lot of people for the behavior of some governments that were corrupt, which directly led to some of the uprisings in Egypt and Tunisia, because the information that people got through the cables was much more credible than when just an NGO was saying, oh, you know, this regime is corrupt. And so the ultimate impact of WikiLeaks is forcing everybody to question the secrecy in diplomacy, the frailty of the information system, the non-linearity of elements. What is the response? Because there was a breach. I mean, there's a breach of law. There is something that was obviously harmful in a certain direction. And so what is the response? The WikiLeaks case is maybe less important as itself as an example of the challenges we're facing. And so I do believe, to close this answer, that paradigm shifts are not always a replacement or an either-or. To give you a concrete example, if I take this watch and I drop it, I don't need relativity or quantum physics to understand where it will fall. I mean, Newtonian physics perfectly work on that one, because we are in normal conditions. If you go at very big speeds, you need relativity, and if you go to subatomic dimensions, you need quantum physics. Multi-stakeholder approach is a little bit like this. It doesn't require the existing governance framework to change. But when they have to deal with a cross-border issue, to a global issue, to a complex issue, if you don't use the multi-stakeholder model, you simply cannot solve the problem. So it is a revolution, but a quiet revolution. It is a transformational evolutionary rather than revolutionary thing. And I'm trying to encourage everybody to say, this is a non-zero-sum game. Everybody gains by putting in place those systems, because we can find the solution to basically manage the coexistence of people on cyberspace. Okay, I think I've kept you for a long time. I want to finish with 3 quotes, or 2 quotes. Saint-Exupéry is the French writer who wrote Le Petit Prince. You may know. This is my favorite quote. It's at the end of every single mail that I send. There's no greater mission for humans than uniting humans. And Jean Monnet is the person who, the Frenchman, who actually invented the foundation for the European Union. And he said, when an idea corresponds to the necessity of the time, it no longer belongs to those who invented it and becomes stronger than those who are in charge of implementing it. I strongly believe it's the case for the multi-stakeholder approach, or to put it more simply, because multi-stakeholderism is an awful word, hard to pronounce and hard to understand. The bottom line is the right for every person on Earth to participate in an appropriate manner in the governance processes that deal with the issues that they are concerned with. It's the ultimate understanding of democracy, which is not only representation, but participation. And just a last note of caution, for those of you who are familiar with the work of Stefan Zweig, you may remember that at the beginning of the 20th century, Stefan Zweig was among a group of people who were very cosmopolitan, traveling through Europe, dreaming of a unification of Europe and complete friendship, a little bit like Erasmus in his own time. Unfortunately, both Erasmus and Stefan Zweig were confronted, for Erasmus, with the religious wars, and for Stefan Zweig with the First and the Second World War. Because unfortunately, not everybody shares the peaceful attitude and the desire for coexistence. I always put this at the end of my presentations because what I've described seems to be so nicely flowing into a harmonious cooperation between all actors. This is not going to be the case. We are entering a period of potential high tension, and whenever I make this presentation, I want to encourage all of you to consider that this is not an academic subject. This is about your responsibility as international citizens to be aware that there is a battle going on and that we need to make those new modalities prevail for the benefit of everybody. It's not the benefit of one against the others, but not succeeding in putting that in place is actually likely to lead us into very big periods of turmoil. So be realist and optimist. And with that, I thank you for your patience. If you want to connect with me, this is my email, bdelachapelle@gmail.com. And you're highly welcome to contact me. And thank you for your patience.